So in today's video, I'm going to show you a somewhat unusual method for painting waves, and we're going to use it to paint this ocean landscape scene in Procreate. Throughout this video, I'm using the Alpine brushes to paint everything. However, the method I'm using to make the waves in particular mostly relies on built-in features in Procreate, and you can still apply the same process with different brushes. So as you can see, I've got a rectangle kind of sketched out here, and this is just a rough guide that's going to help me frame the scene. And the first thing I need to paint is a background wash. So for that, I'm going to grab the fuzzy round brush from the Alpine brushes, and I'm going to use a very light kind of powdery blue tone, and I'm going to use this to create a kind of side-to-side background wash like this, and this is all one continuous brush stroke. Now this scene is going to have waves in the foreground, and then the sky is going to be pretty blank. That's why I like the sky to have a little bit of line texture like this, so I'm not going to mess with that. But down here, I'd kind of like it to be smoother. So I'm going to change my brush to the Misty Water Blender, and I'll just kind of dot this around down here to smooth it out. Now this next step is optional, but I want to create a mask that will sort of cover up everything that goes outside of our sketch, and it's pretty easy to do. I'm just going to make a blank layer and place it just below the sketch. Then I'll change my color to pure white. And I need some kind of pen brush, so I'm going to use the Forster Fine Liner. And maybe at a small size like this, I'm just going to roughly follow our sketch. And then when I get back to the original position, I'll hold it there so Procreate snaps it like this. I'll try my best to line it up with the sketch. There we go. Then I need to fill in all the area outside of this, and I can do that by just dragging our color picker onto that blank area. And you can see it hasn't deleted anything or cleared anything. It's just a layer like this that's just covering up everything that's below it. And once our background wash is finished, I'm going to move on and add the mountains. So for that, I'll make a blank layer just above our background wash. I'll choose another blue tone like this. It's not super critical because we can adjust it later on. For the brush, I'm going to use the Rugged Mountain brush. And I'm just going to create two mountains like this. Next, I want to soften and blend the base of these mountains. So for that, I'm going to grab the Misty Water Blender again, and I'll use it at a pretty big size, and I'll just blend them like this. And I think overall the mountains look pretty good, but I think they're too dark. So I'm going to adjust that by going to the hue, saturation, and brightness, and just messing with these until it looks right. And once the mountains are finished, we can finally move on and start painting the water. Now for me personally, I think it's easier to paint the water if I turn off the mask, so I'm just going to disable that temporarily. The water is going to be on a blank layer just below the mountains, but still above the background. For the brush, I'm going to use the fuzzy round, and I'll choose a pretty dark kind of ocean blue tone like this. And I'm just going to use this brush to create a pretty crazy kind of back and forth wash like this. And I'm sort of pulsing the brush to create strokes like this. After that, I'm going to go over this again, but I'm going to use a much lighter blue tone. And that looks pretty good. The mountains are kind of bugging me, so I'm just going to switch those off temporarily. And after you've got a wash that looks something like this, I'm going to apply a slight Gaussian blur to it. I don't want to blur it too much. I think maybe around 8 or 9% is good. There we go. Then after that, I'm going to apply a motion blur, which is kind of an option just below Gaussian blur. And I'm just going to tap on the screen and slide to the right, and then maybe down a little bit. And you can see right away, this is starting to look like a sort of blurry water texture. There we go. And once the basic water texture is roughed out like this, we need to give it some perspective. So to do that, I'm going to grab the arrow tool and set it to distort. I'll zoom out here, and I'm just going to pinch the top and kind of flare out the bottom. And this is going to give it a sort of forced perspective look. Another thing you can do is after you use distort, you can change to warp, and you can use that to pull out the bottom as well. And I think that looks pretty good. So I'll leave the arrow tool, and I'll turn the mask back on, and the mountains as well. And I'll position the water a little bit better here. There we go. After that, I'm going to finish up the water by adding a couple of key details. The first thing I'm going to do is add a sort of overall global lighting effect. So I'm going to make the kind of far away water a little bit lighter, and the closer water is going to be darker. So to do that, I'm going to grab the freehand selection tool, and I'll just select the distant water first. Then I'll feather out that selection, and I'm going to go to my curves adjustment this time. And if you set it to gamma, there's kind of a trick here. If you raise this node up, it'll brighten things, and if you move it to the right, it'll darken them. So for this, I'm going to raise it up to brighten it. There we go. Then I'll do the same thing here to the closer water, but I'm going to darken it. So as I mentioned, I'll use the curves tool and just move this node to the right. The next thing I'm going to do is sharpen up some of the shadows and highlights here in the foreground. I think it's okay that the waves are pretty blurry in the distance, but it looks nice if these are kind of more glossy and a bit harder. So to do that, I'm going to grab the automatic selection tool, and I'm going to start with the highlights. So I'm just going to tap and drag on a few highlights. I think that'll work. Then I'll go to my curves adjustment again, and I'm going to raise it up to brighten those just a little bit. There we go. Then I'll do the same process again, but this time to the shadows, and I'll darken them more. And this looks pretty good, but sometimes it makes the highlights and the shadows a bit too sharp. So I'm going to go in there with the water blender again, the misty one, and I'll just carefully soften up some of the hard edges. And now for the last wave detail I want to add, I want to create a sort of sparkling, misty highlight effect. So for that, I'll make a blank layer above my waves. I'll choose pure white, and I need to use some kind of splatter brush, so I'm going to use the snowy speckles, and I'll just loosely kind of tap this around. I don't want to do too many highlights, I think it can be kind of distracting, but once I've kind of covered it like this, I'm going to use the eraser brush to erase any of the highlights that are appearing where I don't want them to be. And it's definitely a pretty subtle effect, but I think it's good enough. And now that the water is totally finished, I'm going to add the mist here that kind of divides the mountains and the water. So for that, I need to make a blank layer that's above the mountains. I'll use a pretty light powdery blue tone like this. For the brush, I'll go back to the fuzzy round, and I'll just paint this around the middle area. And I think that's pretty good. After that, I'm going to switch to the regular water blender, and I'm going to try to blend it kind of at an angle, both the top and the bottom, just to give it a sort of rising mist effect. After that, I can move on and add the details in the sky. And it's pretty straightforward. I'm just going to make a blank layer above everything, and I'm going to rough those out using the Forster Fine Liner, but you could use any pen brush for this. And this looks really good, but I think the whole scene here is a little bit unbalanced, and that's because there's a lot going on down here, but the sky is pretty blank. So I think I'm going to add a sort of glowing effect around the sun to balance this. So if you want to do that, just make a layer that's just above the background wash. Then I'm going to find some kind of bright yellow-orange tone. I'll use the fuzzy round brush, and I'm just going to create a sort of concentric wash like this, kind of radiating out of the sun. After that, I'm going to go to the hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'm going to refine the color here so it blends in with the scene a bit better. And in this case, the edges look a little bit too hard, so I'm going to finish this up by applying a Gaussian blur. And just like that, this illustration is finished. As you can see, I did go in there and add a couple more kind of sparkles on the water. I think because the sun turned out pretty bright in this illustration, it made sense to add some more details to the highlights. If you think I've earned it, please give this video a like, and here are 2 more landscape watercolor tutorials I think you'll love to watch next.